In the last lesson, we looked at some of the Christian responses to the problem of evil by looking at the sort of generalized idea of Christian theodicy. Well, in this lesson, we're going to carry on talking about Christian responses to the problem of evil by focusing specifically on the work of St. Augustine. Augustine being one of the key foundational church fathers and developer of a number of different biblical and Christian practices. So, we're going to be examining the nature of the problem of evil and explore how Augustine approached this particular issue, the problem of evil more generally, but also the issue of the inconsistent triad, the concept that an all-loving and all-powerful God would be inconsistent with the belief that evil exists. And so how Augustine approaches it, and as such we're going to be talking about Augustinian theodicy and looking at one of the main Christian approaches to the problem of evil. Now, St. Augustine, and specifically Augustine's theology, is based principally on both biblical interpretation, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, as well as the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. He was influenced quite heavily by Platonic philosophy. And this is because Plato believed in the existence of the realm of the forms. And the realm of the forms and the idea of the forms, according to Plato, was that everything in existence had its own ideal form. And this was where the realm of the forms is what the imperfect world is based on. So things in the imperfect world are simply imperfect copies of the ideal forms that exist. So for example, a chair, there exists in some realm, in some reality, the ideal form of a chair, and that just chairs in the real world are simply imperfect representations, imperfect copies of the ideal form of the chair. Now, Plato believed that imperfection, and this concept of the imperfection within reality, was just part of the concept of reality. The idea that we have this nature and this realm of the forms, and that reality is copied from that within that process is the instillment of some kind of imperfection. However, Augustine did not accept this part of reality, because he believed that as being a Christian and being somebody who was influenced very heavily by biblical interpretation, he believed that God created the universe and did not create it deliberately with imperfections. So this is really where Plato and Augustine, part ways in terms of their beliefs. And this is something that, one example of the concept of God creating the universe, for a start, which is found in various points within Genesis. And in this particular passage, it states that God saw what he had made and it was very good. So effectively what we have here is the interpretation of this being that God did not create the world in some kind of imperfect way. He created the world in a way that was perfectly good, or at least very good, according to Genesis. Now, when it comes to the inconsistent triad, this is part of Augustine's thought process when it comes to the problem of evil. Because we have the concept that God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, and that evil also exists, but Augustine did not accept that God would create the world deliberately with evil. This is some way in which we can explain the existence of evil in a world where we have an all-loving and all-powerful God. We could say that God deliberately created evil in a way, maybe as a test or maybe even as a way to show that what the good is. We can understand that by looking at evil. However, Augustine rejected this, and so therefore rejected the concept that evil was some kind of real and positive quality, that evil was actually something that even existed at all. Instead, he simply believed that evil was almost a negation or a privation of the good, and he called this privatio boni. This is the concept, the Latin concept of evil being some kind of negation of the good. And a way in which we can explain this concept is to look at the analogy of a light and a shadow. Because just as a shadow does not have its own separate existence, it's not a thing that exists in reality, it is simply just the absence of light, or the negation of light, or the blocking of light by some object. Evil acts in a very similar way. It doesn't have this kind of separate existence. It's not its own thing. It is simply just the lack of good, the negation of good. And so, but where did this come from? Where did this concept come from? And this is where we see Augustine start to draw more and more on biblical interpretation, and we talk about the fall. And in Augustine's view, evil first came into the world through the fall of the angels, which we can find in various different references in the Bible, and even non-biblical texts as well, things like the Apocrypha. Now, he said that all angels are made perfect, but some received less grace than others. Now, if you want to know more about Augustinian concept of grace, we'll do a lesson on that when we start looking at Christian theology. But the point of this being that some were created in less a way than others, and as such they fell away from God, which resulted in a misuse of their free will. And we know that according to Augustine, free will is the cause of our doing evil. Thy just judgment is the cause of our having to suffer the consequences. This is from Augustine's Confessions. So not only is evil, when we're talking about, if we're being a bit more philosophical, if we talk about the ontology of evil, the ontology of evil is simply that it does not exist as a separate thing in the world. It is simply the negation of the good, and it comes from the free will, and free will that is what causes our doing evil. This is what Augustine believed. Now, there are a number of criticisms with this argument. There are a couple that we're going to look at here, one notably from the philosopher John Hick. But one criticism is that evil seems to be a little bit more definite. At least it seems to be a little bit more definitive as well than it's just being some kind of negation of the good. What do we mean when we say it's just the negation of the good? Do we really accept that evil acts such as the Holocaust or slavery can be just simply viewed as negations of the good? It seems to be that there is something extra to this, that the truest and the most diabolical forms of evil that exist in the world, things like the Holocaust and genocide, these seem to be more than just a lack of good. They seem to be something actively in the world that effectively causes this evil to take place. Well, Augustine doesn't really come to any conclusion of that. Augustine would reject this argument and say that no, evil is just a figment of our free will and simply a negation of the good that exists, the privatio boni that exists. And so therefore, when we are looking at things like horrible, horrendous evils such as the Holocaust, we are having to reconcile this with the fact that it might not be some extensive separate thing that exists in the world. It could simply just be a negation of the good. Finally, we could talk about Augustine's view that some angels were given more grace than others. This is something that isn't actually explained as to why within Augustine's framework. Why is it the case that some angels were given more grace than others? Is it the case that God decided that? In which case we have the issue of the inconsistent triad again. We have the problem of the three concepts existing contradictory to each other. So you have the concept of the omnipotence of God and the omnibenevolence of God, and then you have the concept of evil existing. Well, if God decided to create angels with more grace than others, then surely if we add another concept into this, the omniscience of God, the all-knowing nature of God, surely God would have known that this would cause some to use their free will and then misuse their free will for evil. In which case, then it is effectively God's fault because they could have stopped it. This is a problem that Augustine's theory doesn't actually manage to address. According to the philosopher John Hick, the idea of an unqualifiedly good creature committing sin is self-contradictory and unintelligible. If the angels are finitely perfect, then even though they are in some way, they are in some important sense free to sin, they will never, in fact, do so. And this is effectively what John Hick argues in relation to the concept of these angels falling from heaven. If they are finitely perfect, then even if they are in some sense free and they use their free will, they should never have to, or never in any way misuse their free will to do sin, to do evil, because they are already finitely perfect. So these are a couple of arguments that we can levy against the Augustinian conception of the problem of evil. In the next lesson, we'll talk about other religious interpretations of the problem of evil. We can talk about Jewish and we can talk about Islamic, as well as Hindu and Buddhist conceptions of evil, and how they all attempt to answer this question of why evil exists in the world.